Hello everyone. Tonight we start with the strange, often gory, sometimes inadvertently amusing realm of medieval medicine, a time when the majority of doctors were 3 parts self-assured nonsense in a huge robe, 2 parts guesswork, and 1 part scholar. Tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you're tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's adventure together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. As a medieval physician, you feel incredibly qualified. You have a long robe, can pronounce phlegmatic, and have a Latin book that you once sort of skimmed during a thunderstorm. Not because you passed an exam, trained under an expert, or even because your treatments are effective. Just before dawn, you awaken in your timber-framed house. The scent of candle wax, damp straw, and the hazy sorrow of yesterday night's onion stew permeates the air. Nothing more than lumpy hay in a bag is your mattress. At 30, you are respected, experienced, and just one unexpected infection away from retiring in this day and age. You prepare for a full day of healing, a term you use loosely, by stretching and coughing gently into a towel. A stethoscope hasn't been created, thus you don't own one. You also don't use soap. You believe that judgmental glares and incense have antibacterial properties. No one asks, yet your wall is devoid of official credentials. Ultimately, you are able to communicate in Latin, possess 4 complete books, and once pronounced a man cured after he vomited in 4 different ways. In a sense, you are a miracle worker. You wear a huge hat to conceal the fact that you have no idea what's causing all the boils and lengthy woolen robes to demonstrate your education. Your medical bag is slung over your shoulder. There are knives, dried herbs, and the glimmering hope that no one will ask you to describe how kidneys function. Like most days, you will check urine, diagnose persons with humoral imbalances, and possibly draw blood from a toothache patient. You're not concerned. This is something you've done numerous times, most likely. Additionally, you have backup justifications in case things don't work out. Mars is in the wrong house once more, or there is bad air or wicked activity. In the worst situation, you suggest prayer and gradually retreat. After finishing your bread, you go outside and take a sip of weak ale, which is safer than water. You're more than just a man. No one needs to know that you once used mashed garlic and pigeon feathers to treat a stomachache. You are a doctor, a healer, and a scholar. For now, it's your secret. Like all great careers in medicine, your day starts with a tumbler of warm urine. Of course, not yours. That would be strange. Your first patient, who was kind enough to deliver it in a clay jar just after morning, is the owner of this one. The temperature remains warm. In your field of employment, freshness is important. You hold it up to the light and place it on the table like a beautiful wine. What little light comes in through your small window, which is blackened with smoke. You gently swirl it, take a deep breath, and then make a reflective sound with your mouth that indicates that this man is obviously experiencing a lot of phlegm and perhaps envy. Introducing uroscopy, the medieval practice of using urine analysis to diagnose diseases. Its color, clarity, thickness, smell, and yes, sometimes taste, are your main diagnostic instruments. Stethoscopes are obsolete. Thermometers are out of style. You have a hazy chart from a Flanders monastery, 16 colors of yellow, and an instinct refined over years of acting as though you know what you're doing. Pale and clear, that's excellent. Deep orange, liver problems. Brown and murky, hot bile or punishment from Mars most likely. Blue, witchcraft. Witchcraft, no doubt. Your patient may be near death if there are bubbles in their urine. Just to be safe, you might still inform them they're going to die if it doesn't. People value honesty after all. Similar to heating soup in the microwave before serving, you could even use a candle to warm the sample and awaken the humors. When your patient nervously asks what's wrong, you nod smartly, point to the jar, and answer something like, "Your collar is inflamed and your spleen is melancholic." You then write down your findings on a small wax tablet and write something vaguely Latin that even you will find difficult to read later. Steer clear of women named Agnes, loud noises, and figs. Confused and somewhat reassured, you give them a purse of herbs, a little talisman, and maybe a leech, and send them go. In the end, it doesn't matter if you cure them. What counts is that you sound like you could if you truly wanted to. You don't inquire about your patient's sleep, diet, or exposure to rotten bread as a medieval physician. No, you ask the pertinent questions, such as how frequently black bile has visited you this week, because everyone is aware that 4 precious fluids govern your body: phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood. It has nothing to do with nutrition, viruses, or germs. Future rubbish, that is. It is your responsibility to ensure that none of the ingredients in the human body are winning. It is essentially a boiling cauldron of wet medieval soup. Suppose your patient is flushed and furious. Too much blood, obviously. The remedy? You remove a portion of it. Are they pale and exhausted? It's too much phlegm, most likely from consuming cold food or conversing with someone who lacks moral integrity. The presence of yellow bile indicates irritability and vomiting. Bile that's black? That one covers almost everything else, including poetry, melancholy, and dreams. Your entire approach to medicine is merely sophisticated plumbing with a moral twist. You can use enemas, food, herbs, vomiting, bleeding, or ideally all of the above to balance the humors. You suggest cold, dry food if the body is hot and wet, since the solution to internal imbalance is obviously additional instability, but in the other manner. Logic is not necessary for your patient. They must face yeast and boil sage in goat milk. Naturally, no 2 physicians can agree on the precise amount of bile that is excessive. That's okay, though. You sound deeper when you disagree. To fill in any knowledge gaps, you employ terms like temperamental flux and humoral unease. If they die, it wasn't your fault. The key thing is to appear calm when they're in a panic. It was their phlegm, or maybe Saturn, or that immoral way of life they had before coming to you for assistance. You maintain your dignity in either case. Because even though nobody, including you, really understands what the humors are doing, they must be followed in medieval medicine. Healing isn't the point. When suggesting mustard plasters for a broken rib, it's about striking a balance and sounding impressive. You believe in balance, particularly the balance of humors, as a medieval physician. And there's just one thing to do when something seems strange, as when your patient has a fever, headache, or a nightmare about pigs. Release the blood. A diagnosis is not necessary for you. Before breakfast, you need a bowl, a knife, and the guts to take action. The concept is straightforward. The blood is wet and heated. A little drainage restores peace or oblivion whether someone is overheated, overly wet, or just a bit irritating. In any case, you've finished your assignment. If you're feeling fancy, you may open a vein behind your knee or in your arm. Only severe situations or particularly dramatic flares are appropriate for the neck. You have a chart from a monk in the 12th century that informs you which vein goes with which organ, so don't worry. Most likely it's correct. He exuded confidence. Even if it might just be anticipating regret, your patient is lying down with their arm outstretched and their face pallid. You make the cut, mumble something Latin to sound erudite, then tie a tight cloth to make the veins expand. The flow of blood starts. You give a serious nod. Your helper passes out. The blood is collected in a ceramic basin, just enough for the patient to stop complaining or begin wobbling. There is no specific dosage. Some medical professionals assert that the thickness or odor of the blood can reveal the sickness. Most of the time, you also act as though you can. Sometimes, if you want something far more wriggly and hands-free, you replace the blade with a leech. Leeches are industrious, silent, and reusable. They listen quite well, too. After it's over, you give the arm a wrap, suggest relaxation, and offer some weak beers, but not too much. Phlegm is increased by sloth. You pronounce the patient better if they leave. If they faint, the purge was successful. It's too late to treat them if they die, because bloodletting is a way of life in your society, not merely a treatment. You still haven't eaten your turnip porridge. After completing your morning bloodletting ritual, you wipe your hands on your robe or the closest apprentice and get ready for the main opportunity of the day, house calls. In particular, the houses of people who can afford amenities like walls, servants, and living. For practice, peasants are acceptable, although they usually receive payment in work, chickens, or a heartfelt thank you. Conversely, noble families pay with cash, praise, and sometimes uncomfortable invitations to dinner where someone is clearly dying at the table. You fill your bag with leeches, ointments, wounds, and a variety of dried plants that all have a faint hay and melancholy scent. You check that your robe is hefty and your cap is tall. This is about being present, not simply about healing. A servant who obviously doesn't trust you greets you when you arrive at the manor, but he doesn't say anything because you're wearing velvet and have a bag of blades with you. The air smells of moist stone, boiling something, and beeswax. A woman passes out in the corridor. Nobody brings it up. There are worried family members and tapestries all around your patient as they lie in a four-poster bed. They have a foot that is swollen, a fever, and a strong conviction that you would use whatever is in that jar to cure them. You pose the typical queries. What have they consumed? How frequently do they take a bath? Never. Has Mercury and Saturn recently come into contact? After that, you cautiously gaze into the flames for 5 seconds before declaring that there is a humoral imbalance, most likely due to bile. Unless the symptoms get worse on Sundays, it's definitely not demonic. You provide an authoritative recommendation, maybe a poultice of powdered snail shell and crushed mint. You advise them to stay away from red meat, cold wind, and overthinking. They're already doing a fantastic job with the bed rest you recommend, in the hopes that you are more valuable than the priest who came by last week, sprayed everything with holy water, and then walked away. The lady of the house presses coins into your hand before you depart. You remind them, nod earnestly, and swear to come back. If the swelling increases, send someone for you right away. Call for the priest if it starts to descend. It's known as a medical bag. The others term it an excuse to run. Your satchel is filled with a frightening assortment of items that wouldn't look out of place in a dungeon, rather than with hope or healing. This is your daily carry, though. This is your medieval medical kit, your excitement and pride. Please keep your portable cabinet motionless. Before every visit, you open it up like a magician showing off his skills. Within, a horrifying combination of rusty, sharp, faintly holy, and utterly unclean. Your knives come first. Genuine knives, not scalpels that are sufficiently keen to pierce skin but not so sharp as to instill trust. One for spreading soft cheese at lunch, one for cutting, and one for draining. They all have the same appearance. Then there are the hooks, which are used to extract diseased teeth or move objects that shouldn't be there. You have a trepon, cautery irons to seal wounds with fire, and saws for amputations. When someone has a headache that is obviously caused by spirits trapped in their brain, they can use this cute little drill to open skulls. Of course you have leeches, wriggling enthusiastically in a little jar. They're all named. You make an effort to avoid becoming attached. You store your powders and ointments in a smaller pouch. Ground antler, dried lizard tails, crushed herbs, and possibly some dubious stone that someone said healed stomach problems. Nothing has been given a label by you. Guessing is more enjoyable. Additionally, there is a urine flask that is used for diagnosis and occasionally serves as a paperweight in case your notes are picked away by the wind. Not to be overlooked is the astrological wheel for figuring out whether Venus is destroying your patient's spleen. Bandages, uncommon, soap, conceptual, pure water. Oh, you cover everything with a cloth that hasn't been cleaned since the last pandemic, hoping that no one will inquire as to why the sword has dried blood on it. You describe St. Sebastian's relic. They give a respectful nod. Both of you go on, and in some way you gain authority from this bag, this dreadful, ringing, and maybe cursed object. People assume you know exactly what you're doing when you enter a room and open it. Which you do, in a sense. You're trying your hardest, but you're not wearing gloves. As soon as you enter the sick room and see the pale, perspiring aristocrat lying on the bed, you turn to the sky, the most sensible source of medical advice. Yes, you are a cosmic cartographer of human pain as well as a physician, and without verifying whether Jupiter is being especially critical today or whether Saturn is in opposition, no diagnosis in your universe is complete. You grab your go-to zodiac chart, which is filled with symbols that would make a contemporary science teacher shudder. Pisces rules the feet, whereas Aries rules the head. And like a medieval gaming board, everything in between is properly separated across the horoscope. It is obviously a negative omen if the patient has stomach pains while the moon is in Virgo. Not for you, for them. You give a slow, dramatic nod. As you whisper about Mercury retrograding close to their liver, the patient looks on with wide eyes. You explain that the stars regulate the body's humor flow. Fever is caused by Mars. Sadness is a result of Saturn. Venus, that one leads to embarrassing family drama and unwarranted swelling. Time is of the essence. When the moon is waxing, you wouldn't dare do bloodletting. Everyone is aware that this is the cause of marital issues and unexpected fainting. God forbid a solar eclipse coincide with a child's birth. That's essentially inviting the child to grow up with strong opinions and a limp. This system is rarely questioned by patients. It sounds clever after all, and it provides them with a nebulous explanation for their illnesses. For example, Mars being irate instead of "you licked moldy bread again." Sometimes you chart their specific horoscope to make the consultation go more smoothly. Their birth hour, rising sign, and the moon's position 3 days before to their first sneeze. All the important information needed to figure out why they have burning bile in their shoulder. When your diagnosis is finished, you present it with respect. Venus is moist this week, which is why your phlegm is heavy. Nobody, not even you, understands what that means. However, they give a nod. They make the payment. They appreciate your wisdom. And you're off, celestial leech magician, prepared to use a candle, a compass, and the misplaced faith of the sick to heal more souls. With a knife you also use to cut cheese. You are going to slit a man open. Everything will work out perfectly. Today is the day of the procedure. The swelling has begun to smell like fried onions, and someone finally shouted loud enough to draw your attention. Not because the moon is correct or the patient's humor is serene. You arrange your tools, a bone saw, a dull knife, a wine-soaked handkerchief, and something that looks like bravery. Anesthesia is not present. In addition to a cup of ale, the patient is advised to chew on something wooden and reflect on pleasant recollections. You soothe him by saying something like, "This may sting a little," and smiling warmly, "It won't. It'll hurt a lot." You start chopping. Someone is shouting. There's trembling. Eventually someone faints. I hope it's not you. Your assistant seems like he would like to be an apprentice to a corpse or a baker, while simultaneously holding the patient down. When the wound opens, you do what all medieval surgeons do. Confidently prod around and pray for divine direction. You may use what appear to be garden shears to extract a rotting tooth, remove sick flesh, or drain some enigmatic fluid. Germs are not a major concern for you. You are unaware of their existence. You think that moral weakness or contaminated air are the causes of infection. In any case, since the last procedure, which involved a goat, your instruments have not been cleansed. Perhaps. You didn't inquire. After the procedure is finished, you apply wine to the wound for washing and show, and then you seal it with either hot iron or oil-soaked spiderwebs, which sound great but are dubious from a medical standpoint. You tell the patient to rest after wrapping it in linen. In 2 days he will either miraculously heal or pass away. In any case, you contributed. If someone criticizes your work, you point out that Galen is still regarded as a genius, despite the fact that he once used a bronze hook to remove a gladiator's spleen. Because success isn't the goal of surgery in your universe. It all comes down to speed, confidence, and the patient yelling a little less than normal. Slap a leech on it if you're unsure. Or a few, or a dozen, depending on your level of seriousness. You've attempted to pray. You have experimented with herbs. You've even attempted to cut them as delicately as a butcher on market day, applying live worms to a human body while nodding like, though you know what you're doing, however, is the epitome of professional medicine. The best treatment is leeches. Medieval medicine's Swiss Army knife. A fever. Leech. Do you have a headache? Leech. Ankle swelling. A broken heart. Unidentified shaking caused by a ghost. More leeches, more leeches. You keep them in what you refer to as the wriggling chalice of marvels, a little jar. They are fed well, kept moist and irritable. I hope they're not overfed. A lazy leech is disliked by all. Naturally, the patient is skeptical. They think you're angry when they see a slimy black worm. However, you reassure them that this is an old and sophisticated custom, followed by knowledgeable men dressed in elegant robes. You fail to note that some of those men were barbers, attempting to attract customers, based just on the smell of boiled socks, or monks making wild guesses. You pick a leech that looks healthy, plump, active, and bloodthirsty, like a little gothic vampire. You apply it to the skin, usually on a veiny area of the forearm or behind the ear, and then you wait. You grin and add, "Ah yes, the leech agrees with your imbalance, if it swiftly takes hold." You mumble something about Mercury being in retrograde, and try again if it doesn't. The leech quickly swells with blood. Your patient becomes pallid. You act as though this is completely typical. You say stuff like your bile was acting strangely, or he's drawing out the toxins. You use vinegar or salt to eliminate the leech after it is full, or if you're feeling particularly ruthless, you simply let it fall off by itself. Feeling incredibly content and bloated, dizzy and worried, the patient inquires as to whether they have been cured. "We've made a promising start," you remark. You have no concept about translation. However, the leech seemed content, and occasionally that's sufficient to maintain everyone's faith in the magic. The nicest thing about leeches, after all, is that they never demand payment for their labor. You have, as a medieval physician, an interpretive insight of the human mind. You don't have a degree in psychology or neuroscience, and you have no interest in learning about the long-term consequences of stress. You do, however, firmly believe that if someone exhibits strange behavior, it is either supernatural, immoral, or both. A woman who hasn't talked in 2 weeks is your first patient of the day. She hums occasionally, throws a spoon at her husband's cousin, and looks at walls. This can only indicate one thing in your book. You carry out your usual diagnostic procedure while under the influence of spirits, sometimes in plural. Light a candle that has a faint goat fat and despair scent. Sprinkle some holy water and ask the priest if he is available. Then, very seriously, you inform her family that she has become depressed due to either a small demon named Gregory or an overabundance of black bile. Melancholia is, of course, a catch-all diagnosis for depression, anxiety, introversion, poetry, and excessive reading by women. Herbal compresses, forced prayer, bleeding, or if things get really heated, an exorcism are your alternatives for treatment. The monastery or the local madhouse, which is essentially a barn with a padlock and some hay, are options for the truly insane. There, patients are frequently whipped, given cold showers, and have scripture yelled at them. The theory is straightforward. Scare their thoughts back into alignment if it's damaged. Some medical professionals experiment with trepanation, which involves boring holes in the skull to release spirits. You nod politely when someone mentions it, but you haven't tried it yourself. Audacious move. Naturally, women receive more attention. When a person is overly sentimental, her womb wanders around her body like a bored house cat, causing hysteria. You advise her to stop thinking so much and to use a cold compress and soothing herbs. Marriage, perhaps. A pilgrimage, perhaps. God's blessing if the sick gets better. If not, it will be God's will. Your conscience is clear in either case, because mental illness is a cosmic annoyance rather than a disease in your line of work, and your duty is to survive it without contracting it, not to comprehend it. After draining a nobleman's elbow, you strut into town wearing your towering hat and your Latin phrases. Without a doubt, or at least within walking distance, you are the smartest man living. However, catastrophe happens when your patient also visits an apothecary. Dare they? The medieval counterpart of pharmacists. Apothecaries are more sassy and subject to fewer rules. Infuriatingly, they crush herbs, boil roots, create enigmatic pastes, and yet manage to help people. They simply distribute medicine that smells like sorrow and works, without quoting Aristotle or carrying planetary alignment charts. But you're a doctor with a university degree, or at least you have a book that claims to be. Boiling bark or measuring powders are examples of physical labor that you avoid. It is your responsibility to prescribe nebulous concepts, discuss bile, and point out stars. Let the apothecary determine the exact meaning of a cooling tonic with lunar influence. Patients, however, frequently have faith in them. Apothecaries, after all, are local residents, are privy to everyone's secrets, and haven't unintentionally killed someone this week. Instead of burning bandages and clove oil despair, their stores smell of honey and thyme. The competition is intense. They believe you to be an overpaid robe with a deity complex, and you believe they are interfering herbalists. They are accused of using folk treatments to poison the patients. They claim that your spleen is rebellious and that you charge 4 silver coins to mutter. Sometimes reluctantly you band together. They create a medication that might be helpful but won't kill you, and you prescribe a treatment that is so nebulous that it's essentially a vibe. You get credit if the patient gets better. Otherwise, you subtly suggest that the pharmacy did not boil the mandrake root for a sufficient amount of time. Naturally, neither of you really prevails. The local priest says it was divine intervention all along. The patient ends up poorer, and the town receives another health rumor. However, you at least kept your dignity, because being louder, wealthier, and marginally more intimidating than your rivals is all that is required in medieval medicine. Effectiveness is not. You only need to know which plants make patients a little quieter. You don't need to understand how they function. Since you are a medieval physician, you are naturally an authority on plants. The main reason is because everyone thinks you are. You have a book, after all, with illustrations of plants in faded ink, some dried leaves in a pouch, and the assurance of a man who once advised someone to apply sage to a gash on his leg. The patient who comes in today has an inner churning problem, which might be heartbreak, stomach cramps, or even demonic influence. After searching through your bag of mystery plants, you confidently determine that valerian root will work. Why? Because it has a powerful scent and induces drowsiness. There are 2 trustworthy indicators that it is acting. Additionally, you have a supply that you recommend for fleas, digestive issues, and irritable folks. Mandrake is only used when you want to appear enigmatic, nettle is used for pain, and mallow is used for inflammation. It is extremely costly, slightly toxic, and roughly human-shaped, making it ideal for impressing the ignorant. The fact is that neither you nor anyone else truly knows what each herb does. You rely on custom, hazy tales, and whatever the neighboring monk claims healed his cousin's goat. In order to make it seem official, you recite Latin words while you enthusiastically grind, boil, and mash. Patients moan less when their spleen tonic doesn't taste like punishment, so occasionally you add honey, not for medical purposes, but just because everything else tastes like wet soil. If the cure is effective, you nod gravely and declare that the herb's cooling properties have triumphed over the fever. If it doesn't, you accuse the patient of not having enough faith, and in desperation you combine a number of herbs and hope that one of them would neutralize the others. It's similar to gambling, but it causes more vomiting. Since wild herbs are obviously stronger, or at least dirtier, you also insist on gathering your own ingredients whenever you can, which enhances the rustic charm. Your herbal remedies are ultimately 50% bluffing, 20% guesswork, and 30% tradition. At least they don't scream when you give them a cup of tea, though. You are never really alone in your medical career, no matter how much leeching, bleeding, or herb mashing you do, since the church is always there like a worried parent or an inquisitive neighbor, and it just so happens to govern your entire political system and worldview. Does your patient have a fever? You should definitely first see if they have repented their sins before attempting a poultice. Coughing up blood? Sounds like a punishment from God. Before opening your apothecary pouch, it would be best to send for the priest. As long as you don't overshadow God, healing is acceptable. You've already received a warning. You once used vinegar and hot pebbles to heal a nobleman's gout. It was thought to be almost magical. You might as well have proposed speaking to trees when you first proposed that the stars might affect digestion, heresy adjacent, and when you briefly contemplated trying cadaver dissection. Naturally, the church has its own beliefs regarding healing, including the use of relics, prayer, and occasionally touching gold-wrapped bones. You don't quarrel. Standing there with a jar of mashed garlic and humiliation, you simply sigh softly and make place for the priest to sprinkle holy water on your patient. Sometimes you even form a team. The priest gives the celestial assurance, and you give the worldly care. It's a miracle if the patient recovers. If they don't, then perhaps you need more incense and God's hidden will is at play. You figured out how to get around it. Just in case someone is listening, You start your treatments with a brief, "May God guide my blade," and conclude with a solid, "Amen." Additionally, you carry a small crucifix in your purse to deter suspicion when someone accuses you of overthinking, not to heal. After all, you are a man of science, a hazy, mushy, blood-stained kind of science. Still, it's hardly the kind that challenges the church. Why not cut off the limb if it is decaying, infected, or just unsightly in general? It's a medieval approach. You have leeched, purged, and bled. You even attempted to wave a bunch of thyme while praying close to the patient. The limb still appears worse than a loaf of bread that has been exposed to the elements for 3 weeks. You'll know it's time to amputate at that point. You don't take this decision lightly, primarily because you didn't eat breakfast and it involves a lot of work. However, you sharpen the saw when the patient's groans have become menacing quiet. The wound is dark and the odor is strange. It is easy to set up. To hold the sufferer down, you locate them a strong friend and a sturdy table. The amputation kit is retrieved by a helper. 1 large jug of ale for medical uses, 1 saw, 1 tourniquet, and 1 cloth to bite. For you, not the patient. Using phrases like necessary, heroic, and possibly survivable, you softly describe the process. The patient becomes pallid. You give a sympathetic nod. If someone with your level of training were aiming a glorified bread knife at your thigh, you would also be anxious. For show, you tie the tourniquet tightly, say something about humor and balance, and then begin cutting. Slowly at first, then more urgently as soon as the shrieking reaches its maximum volume. Skin, fat, muscle, and eventually bone are all bitten by the saw. You act like you're not flinching. You are an expert. After it is removed, you instantly cauterize the stump with a red-hot iron and drop the limb into a nearby pail. It is an unforgettable scent. You point the finger toward the candle wax. Bandaging follows. Tightly covering the wound with linen, you silently hope that an infection won't develop by dusk. You tell the patient to rest, stay out of the cold, and try not to pass away. You are a miracle worker if they live. You solemnly state that the corruption has reached the soul if they don't. It's actually a cruel process. However, there are situations where amputation is the only way to preserve your professional reputation while saving a life, or at least delaying death. Coughing may be heard in the distance. It's time to pretend you didn't and head home. The day has been exhausting. You have removed 1 limb with the elegance of an inebriated carpenter, drained blood, quarreled with apothecaries, and applied leeches to at least 3 bewildered individuals. You're prepared to end the evening. Then you hear it, though. A rattling, a wheeze. It sounds like it came from the underworld when it coughs. You become motionless. Your trainee becomes immobile. The leeches appear tense as well. There's only one explanation. The pandemic has returned. You've already seen it. The enlargement, the spots of black, the scent of gloom and onions. When was the last time it passed through? Your favorite baker just vanished, and your pal, who was a barber surgeon, left town in a cart. You grab your mask. It's because it improves your mood, not because it works. It is full of misplaced confidence, vinegar-soaked cloth, and dried flowers. You don't know how diseases spread, but you do know that you mysteriously stop being a doctor if sick people get too close. You swiftly pack your tools. There isn't time for goodbyes. As you retreat from the settlement, you murmur something about fasting and moon influence. The problem is that there is no effective treatment for plague in medieval medicine. It is impossible to bleed it out, apply a salve to it, or chant it into submission. Your remedies range from setting whole neighborhoods on fire to burning herbs. Sometimes one of those works. You think about putting your results in writing, but you change your mind. You don't want to be known for recommending garlic water as a remedy for humanity's demise. You go to the countryside instead. Go to a monastery, perhaps. Consider becoming a vintner. Anything else than really suspicious groaning and exposed wounds, because you know when to treat, as a medieval physician. More significantly, you are aware of when to vanish. In agreement, the leeches wriggle. It's time according to the stars. Additionally, your robe has a regretful and burned basil scent. Like a medical magician with no answers, you disappear into the mist. What about the locals? He did everything he could, they will claim. Which is accurate in theory. He simply did it from a distance. Imagine entering a magnificent medieval cathedral. Like trees, stone columns rise. The air is filled with incense. Additionally, heavenly light is dispersed throughout the pews by stained glass windows. Ordinarily, you would anticipate bishops wearing royal vestments and serious monks reciting Latin prayers. Not today, though. A man wearing a bishop's mitre is up front today. He's also intoxicated. He is wearing backward robes. Ash has smudged his face. He simply mooned the altar and stuck out his tongue to bless the congregation. The Feast of Fools welcomes you. Among the most ludicrous displays that the medieval church ever allowed, held annually, especially in France, around the start of the new year, an approved burst of chaos was the Feast of Fools. The concept was straightforward. For a day, turn the church, the most inflexible institution in medieval Europe, inside out. Choir boys in clerical costumes. A fool bishop, also known as a lord of misrule, was chosen by the low-ranking deacons to lead fake masses that featured parodies, foul language, and occasionally actual barnyard animals. Imagine the janitor, blindfolded and squandered, taking on the role of CEO for a full day. That's the ridiculousness we're discussing. The wildest portion, though, comes next. This was not just permitted by the church. It was hosted by them. In actuality, the cathedral chapters themselves frequently planned the celebrations. Why? Because the inflexible social structure required a release mechanism. Medieval France was a stuffy place to live. Landlords were obeyed by peasants. Bishops were obeyed by clergy. And everyone did what God said. Otherwise, their only legitimate opportunity to yell, laugh, and make fun of everything that imprisoned them was during the Feast of Fools. It resembled an exorcism combined with Mardi Gras. With the joyful immunity of jesters, participants shouted blasphemies, played lutes, sang obscene songs, and paraded around the streets while wearing masks. They occasionally even entered churches on donkeys. Wine took the place of holy water. They turned sermons into obscene poetry. Candle wax, and mayhem filled the air. It wasn't just foolish fun either. In disguise, it was societal satire. They understood exactly who they were making fun of. They were ruled by elites in gilded thrones and ivory towers, and the joke was finally on them for a single day. The outcome? Sung in flawless choirboy harmony, holy anarchy. Even a kingdom founded on chaos requires a ruler. Furthermore, that monarch wasn't a king, bishop, or baron at the time of the Feast of Fools. It was the Lord of Misrule, a crown-wearing court jester chosen from the lowest echelons of the clergy, or occasionally even the most ridiculous alcoholic in town. Imagine this. Unexpectedly, a gangly kid from the cathedral choir, who is hardly able to grow a beard, is paraded through the town on a homemade beer barrel throne. He blesses the gathering by throwing cabbage at them, while donning pigskin mitre and enormous bishop vestments. This is serious business. It was customary. The living example of reversal was the Lord of Misrule. Everything that was serious turned into a joke. Everything is profane and sacred. He would supervise ridiculous parodies of Christian rites, reverse rituals, and phony processions. They read the gospel backwards. The smoke from the burned shoes took the place of the incense. Additionally, participants howled, snorted, and even meowed like cats in place of sacred chants. The public adored it. For the duration of the day, he was in complete control of the town, presiding over sarcastic sermons and mock rituals that would make a contemporary stand-up comedian blush. Other clowns, jugglers, and unruly church members who might or might not have been sober were part of his court. To thunderous acclaim, they distributed fictitious indulgences, conducted intoxicated trials, and occasionally acted out fictitious excommunications of powerful individuals. This danced so close to heresy that it was both thrilling and scary. However, that was the main objective. This was not mindless mayhem. It was a targeted insurrection masquerading as fun. Actually, it wasn't a coincidence that a peasant or low-ranking teenager was chosen to be the ruler. It was a mocking critique of the sanctity of bishops and the divine authority of kings. People weren't only laughing when they elected someone foolish, they were also demonstrating the absurdity of the actual power systems. How divine they were! If a choir boy could put on the robes and imitate the discourses. The festival's worst excesses were frequently suppressed by church authorities, although they were never completely successful. Year after year the Lord of Misrule returned, louder and more inebriated than before, because people would yearn for a day to break the strict restrictions as long as society had them. You expect gloomy hymns and stern faces when you enter a cathedral. Instead, a half-naked monk juggles communion wafers in the aisle as a man wearing a donkey mask brays from the pulpit. Welcome to the center of the Feast of Fools, when everyone was allowed to cross the line and the hallowed area was transformed into a stage. Real church interiors, those majestic echoing vaults, were supplanted by boisterous parody at the height of the celebration, right in the heart of Christendom, not simply outside on the town square. The canons yelled vulgar jokes, the choir boys danced, and processions included people dressed as demons, women, and animals. It was a complete collapse of divine theater. But the most famous show. During the Ass Mass, a donkey was led inside the cathedral, given the opportunity to bray during significant parts of the service, and occasionally even responded to the priest's commands. At the end, the assembly would exclaim in perfect harmony, "Hee-haw, hee-haw," rather than "Amen." It sounds ridiculous, and it was. However, there was a hint of bitterness in these actions. They were making fun of the church hierarchy's inflexibility, hypocrisy, and conceit in addition to the rituals. It was quite rewarding to transgress the regulations because the people were aware of them. Bishops and priests were frequently divided. In the hopes that the insanity would eventually burn itself out, several people leaned into the joke. Others were incensed and made a valiant effort to put an end to it, denouncing it as obscene and heretical. Bishops sent irate letters, papal bulls were published, and legislation was implemented to curb the excesses. Still, it continued to occur. Why? Since the cathedral was the town's center and the one location that everyone had to take seriously every other day of the year, it was more than just a place of worship. It was liberating to turn it into a carnival ground, not just enjoyable. For one crazy day, fart jokes and beer-soaked spectacle took place against the stone walls, which stood for divine authority. The opportunity to bray like a donkey in God's home when your everyday life is bathed in fear of sin, confession, and everlasting damnation sometimes made even the clergy laugh. That is invaluable. In medieval France, what constitutes a humorous joke? Wearing underpants on your head while delivering a sermon in nonsense Latin, or posing as a bishop and doing a spoof exorcism on cheese. Not only was humor promoted during the Feast of Fools, but it was also used as a weapon. And what's its sharpest target? The fundamental customs that kept civilization cohesive. It was a surgical parody. The Mass was memorized by the participants. After all, they had to. The majority of the performers were choir boys, subdeacons, or minor clergy. This indicated that they were enough familiar with the liturgy to distort it. The outcome was delightfully accurate, blasphemous, and ridiculous. They twisted psalms into drinking songs, copied prayers with coarse rhymes, and preached about the holiness of wine, gluttony, or desire. These weren't only jokes to make people laugh. They were disguised critiques of the widening gap between the public and the clergy. When a parody mass substituted manure smoke for incense, it was a critique rather than merely a shock tactic. In one well-known instance during a fictitious Lent, sausages were supposedly blessed with solemn chants and sacred gestures. In another, a fictitious bishop used a pail concealed beneath his robes to urinate while blessing the audience. Disrespectful, indeed. However, it had a point. Why not expose the church if it professed to be spiritually superior, but engaged in worldly vices? They paraded mock artifacts across the streets. Pig's teeth, chicken bones, or boots are revered with inflated devotion as sacred items. "We know what you're doing and we can do it too," the participants said loudly. For the typical viewer, it was heart-stopping. It was a crisis for the church. However, this derision was also a kind of involvement. It demonstrated that individuals were still very much involved in their religious lives despite their resistance. They understood and were concerned enough to make fun of it. It was an indirect form of devotion, a method of challenging divine authority through amusement rather than submission. However, not everybody chuckled. Church leaders began to see these performances as spiritual poison, making it harder to distinguish between heresy and satire, and they became impatient as the centuries went by. However, the feast was more than a joke to those who conducted it. It was humor and medicine against a system that was too inflexible to budge. You'd think the church would immediately ban a holiday that was so blatantly impure, so obscene and so vulgar, but they didn't for ages. It was really organized on Monday by some of the same individuals who screamed about its immorality on Sunday. Why? Because this was the Feast of Fools' filthy secret. It was also necessary for the clergy. There was more to church life than just scripture and candles. It was demanding, depressing, and stressful. Numerous clerics joined the ranks at a young age, swore virginity and obedience, and spent their days copying manuscripts, praying, and adhering to strict routines that were mentally taxing. A unique release valve was provided by the Feast of Fools. Occasionally, even priests would literally let their hair down and shed their oppressive robes of religiosity for a single day each year. It was anticipated that many low-ranking churchmen and subdeacons would take part. Some even anticipated it. They could perform, entertain, and indulge without fear of repercussions, because it was their time in the spotlight. They blasted religious hypocrisy from inside, made fun of church politics, and made fun of their superiors. Yes, the festival was blatantly clerical, but it was also irreverent. The folks who turned the church into a circus were the ones who knew it best. To be honest, some bishops chose to ignore it because they found it enjoyable. Allowing a day of mayhem was simpler than dealing with covert uprisings or simmering animosity. Laughing once a year is preferable to breaking under the pressure of quiet. Even the extent of the mockery was subject to regulations. Naturally informal, yet understood. It had unwritten rules and was a game. You'll hear about it if you push too hard, but use cunning to toe the line. You would receive a mug of ale and a wink. However, not everyone in the church was in agreement. By the late Middle Ages, the event was being criticized by reformists as a disgrace to Christian honor. From their pulpits, preachers thundered that the laughter that reverberated through cathedrals would eventually give way to wails of damnation, and that devils danced among the idiots. However, the truth persisted, murmuring in sacristies and cloisters. Those who wore the cross during the day occasionally had to wear a jester's cap at night in order to maintain their sanity. The craziness spread into the streets outside the cathedral. For the clergy, the Feast of Fools was more than just an inside joke. It was a full-fledged comedic community uprising. Every alley was filled with song, laughter, and the occasional drunken battle over who could burp the Lord's Prayer the loudest. Blacksmiths joined parades, bakers stopped baking, and housewives temporarily assumed the role of queens. Markets became impromptu stages, stores shuttered, and individuals exchanged their job attire for clowns, demons, animals, or distorted representations of authority figures. The accused were charged with offenses such as inability to dance or excessive seriousness at mock trials. The penalty? Being paraded around town in nothing but a bedsheet and a chicken on your head is like getting pie in the face. The average medieval individual was crushed for the most of the year by taxes, starvation, illness, and the constant fear of everlasting damnation, which is why the populace adored it. Except for a brief respite during the feast, there was no escape from adversity. Even though everything appeared to be light-hearted and enjoyable, there was more going on. They were responding to each other. They were use absurdity as resistance, humor as a weapon, and laughing as insurrection. Nobody was secure. The Pope, kings and lords may all be portrayed as inebriated puppets pulled through the mud by laughing kids. Beneath a veil of humor, they were daring, even risky deeds. Satire provided a voice to the voiceless. They were also free to express their true feelings about the people in charge of them, as long as it was done in a light-hearted manner. Children even joined in. A kid bishop was chosen in some cities, and he would march through the streets, with a sham clergy following. This was a clear challenge to the system, not just something nice. Why was the real bishop so significant if a child could lead a procession? Local authorities complained, of course. Some towns made an effort to control the overabundance. Enforcing seriousness at the feast, however, was like using a biscuit to wipe up a flood. Every distinction, sacred and profane, ruler and ruled, genuine and absurd, was muddled by the celebration. The world was turned upside down for one magnificent day, and no one wanted for it to stop. It was not going to last forever. More than just sulky municipal officials and local bishops had taken notice of the Feast of Fools by the late Middle Ages. The Roman Church authority was not amused and started to examine closely what was taking place in its own sanctuaries. The horror in papal circles is understandable. Young clerics mooned altars in front of sobbing sculptures of the Virgin Mary. Sacred cathedrals became wine-stained theaters, and Mass was reduced to crass farce. The jeering had become scandalous instead being accepted. Even worse, it wasn't going extinct. It was becoming more imaginative. Bulls denouncing the celebration as demonic, sacrilegious, and a danger to Christian order were issued by popes. The most significant setback occurred in 1445, when the Church of Sens, one of France's oldest and most esteemed archbishoprics, formally outlawed the other territories. Participants were subject to penalties. Clergy may be defrocked if they are discovered making fun of rites. Towns that permitted the event were threatened with excommunication. However, the feast was hardly a peaceful affair. Underground versions thrived despite official prohibitions. People simply shifted the festivities into private residences or back alleyways, or they pretended it was a holiday. Other celebrations such as the Carnival and Mardi Gras, where masks, satire, and mock authority continued to be major themes, carried on the feast's spirit. And let's face it, the feast wasn't just destroyed by the church because it was insulting. It was hazardous, so they killed it. The distinction between respect and disobedience is blurred when choir boys make fun of bishops and peasants make fun of priests. Despite its seemingly innocuous nature, laughter may be a weapon in a rigid environment. It penetrates the hallowed atmosphere of power. It's also difficult to fear something the same way after you've laughed at it. The Feast of Fools had mostly vanished from official calendars by the 1600s. It was no longer safe, sanctioned, or blessed. However, its legacy persisted. The laughs, the mayhem, and the masks would all reappear in various incarnations. Since a holiday can be suppressed, a tradition can be outlawed. The notion that a fool may occasionally see the truth more clearly than a priest, however, cannot be eliminated. As a result, the Feast of Fools vanished from public memory, the church clamped down, and cathedrals fell silent. However, you should reconsider if you believe that the festival's essence has faded. Just now the idiot changed his outfit. The vitality of the feast permeated new facets of culture as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance. Satire, masked pageantry, theater, and carnival. The lengthy shadow of the Feast of Fools is actually visible if you've ever witnessed a Mardi Gras procession or a Shakespeare play in which the court jester challenges authority. The fool of the Middle Ages was more than just a buffoon. He was a walking critique of the establishment and a symbol of inversion. He danced in the face of solemnity, uttered the unsayable, and made fun of the untouchable. This custom persisted, but now it took place in bars, town squares, and traveling regiments rather than churches. Ironically, even the church used tools from the fool's toolbox. Humor, irony, and role reversal were first used in Jesuit plays and morality dramas to impart spiritual precepts. The Mass was being strengthened by the reabsorption of the same instruments that had been used to mock it. It's funny how that operates. The carnivalesque, meantime, emerged as a cultural force throughout secular Europe. The irreverence of the feast was perpetuated by writers like as Rabelais, with his obscene humor and inverted worlds. Court jesters persisted in making fun of kings. Aristocrats were allowed to pose as beggars at masquerade balls, and beggars, if only for a single evening, were allowed to pose as gods. The feast did not disappear in this way. It became decentralized. Each of the dozens of customs that resulted from it carried a remnant of that ancient insanity, the message of questioning authority. Laughing at pomp and inverting the universe persisted despite the laughter leaving the carnivals. Its legacy was also more subversive. Satire resurfaced as a political weapon throughout French and other revolutions. Like the idiots once did in the nave of Notre Dame, Kings and clergy were ridiculed in songs, cartoons, and performances. It's possible that the idiot exchanged his donkey for another one. There was more to the Feast of Fools than a holiday. The concept was that for a single day the world doesn't have to make sense. Laughter may be sacrosanct and ridicule can have significance. The message of the Feast of Fools endures for generations even if it's now buried in history books. The ridiculous can have power. For a single joyous day the strong were ridiculed, the holy were frightened, and the weak took charge, not with swords but with laughter. It was more than a celebration. The entire medieval worldview was reversed. The feast posed a risky query during a period when everyone had a position in the divine order, including kings, bishops, peasants, and priests. Could it be that the entire system was a farce? What if a donkey had a better appearance for the bishop's hat? What if popes were better made by peasants? The feast of all was successful precisely because it came to an end. Everyone was aware that the idiots would return to sweeping floors, the robes would be removed, and the clock would strike midnight. However, everything else became more tolerable because of that brief break in the fabric of reality. It was an approved bit of insanity that served as a sort of spiritual release valve, preventing the larger insanity of everyday life from erupting. We have unknowingly acquired that spirit in the present era. Those boisterous French clergy braying in cathedrals are responsible for every April Fool's Day hoax, every stand-up comedian making fun of politicians, and every carnival float ridiculing the powerful. The legacy endures even in digital culture. The spiritual offspring of the feast are memes, parody accounts, and viral videos that ridicule billionaires, CEOs, and governments. The same laughing, the same impulse, different tools, because sometimes the only way to survive a society that is based on control, fear, and power is to flip it on its head, to mock those in positions of authority, and to mock things that we are taught to respect. The Feast of Fools served as a reminder to medieval Europe that nothing is too sacred to be ridiculed, that kings are mortal, and that bishops are human. The idiot was never merely a clown after all. Held up to the face of power, he served as a mirror, and the world looked in that mirror and saw the truth for one magnificent, chaotic, wine-soaked day every year. Not divine, not flawless, simply human. Imagine a liveried servant on horseback delivering an invitation sealed with the papal insignia. The leader of the Catholic Church and patriarch of the notorious Borgia family, His Holiness Pope Alexander VI, has invited you to dinner. It's not merely a meal, it's the meal, and all the important people will be present, including cardinals, ambassadors, businessmen, noblemen, and perhaps a few hired killers posing as poets. Wearing attentively, you consider whether this will lead to your success or downfall. For a Borgia banquet was more than a meal. It was a stage. There was a whirling storm of ambition, lust, and blood behind the wine, the music, and the silk-draped tables. There was a secret purpose behind every toast. There was strategy with every smile. In the back of their minds, each guest was aware that the wrong word or goblet could spell disaster. These feasts are the subject of legendary stories. According to some, Pope Alexander ate dinner under murals of nude gods, while musicians performed evocative madrigals, and Lucrezia Borgia, decked out in jewels, gave rival monarchs seductive looks. Others murmur of underground passageways, secret entrances, and attendants who have received training in both silence and manners. The poison comes next. The poison, huh? You would hear about slipping powders, poison rings, and wine with a faint almond flavor if you paid attention to the rumors that circulated about Rome like filth. Some claimed that the Pope's affable but violent son, Cesare Borgia, was prepared to kill rivals during dessert by carrying a flask of cantarella, a fabled slow-acting toxin. Was it accurate, or simply misinformation from envious adversaries? Hard to say. Here's the scary bit, though. Nobody could be certain. And the Borgia genius was that uncertainty. They fostered a velvet-wrapped threat aura. A visitor may eat pheasants filled with truffles while making eye contact with the man who gave the order to kill their cousin. Everyone grinned. Because it was riskier to turn down a Borgia's invitation than to accept one, it was more than just hosting a Borgia banquet. It was designed. Each meal, candle, and glass of wine was carefully selected to arouse the senses and conflate fear and awe respectively. These weren't meals. They were power plays designed to astonish, entice, and subtly remind visitors of Rome's true rulers. Let's start with the scene. Tables furnished with gold-encrusted plates that formerly belonged to vanquished monarchs, floors strewn with rose petals, and high-ceilinged hallways dripping with tapestries. The room was filled with incense, myrrh, and the spicy scent of meat that had been slow-roasted for hours. Torches weren't the source of the illumination. It emanated from Venetian glass-lined chandeliers, which gave everything a cozy, unearthly glow. What about the food? Offensive. Figs drenched in honey and imported cinnamon, pheasants packed with figs and almonds, and boars stuffed with pheasants. Whole ships of oysters, still fresh enough to make your tongue twitch, were brought in from the coast. Food was arranged in piles, not to be consumed, but to be appreciated as works of art. Before giving in to excess, guests were supposed to feast with their eyes. However, this was not gluttony for the sake of gluttony. It was a plan. The Borgias kept their guests under control by feeding them like gods. After eating candied citrus and roasted crane, no one is prepared for battle. What about the wine? The vino? Oh, it was served in goblets engraved with the Borgia bull and flowed from fountains cold with snow brought down from the Apennines. Before you knew your glass was empty, waiters filled it again. There were continuous toasts to Rome, the Pope, beauty, and peace. But eyes watched behind the uplifted cups. Who had a drink? Who was hesitant? After that third sip, who went pale? Throughout, musicians performed. Drums, harps, and lutes. During dessert, full choirs would occasionally be concealed behind curtains, their voices rising like ghosts. Cardinals applauded blushingly as dancers in nearly translucent costumes performed. Flaming knives were thrown by jugglers. Sparks flew up toward the vaulted ceiling from fire breathers. There was a double meaning to everything. We have the money, the power, the pleasure, and the poison for every whispered indulgence. Enjoy, eat, and sit. You did as a result, because it was disrespectful to decline their hospitality. But to take pleasure in it, that might also be harmful. A vision shrouded in scandal and silk sat at the center of each Borgia feast. Borgia Lucrezia, gorgeous, intelligent, and always contentious. She was not merely the daughter of the Pope. The most notorious events in Rome were hosted by her. Lucrezia was not there to set the table. She had golden hair, kind smiles, and a mind as sharp as any blade in her brother's sleeve. It belonged to her. Visitors either scared or loved her. Usually both. Any meal became a theatrical experience when she was around. With the ease of a seasoned politician, she would move between ambassadors and dukes, making even the most guarded men lean in with laughter and praises that cut like glass. Her comments were always thoughtful, her neckline bold, and her dress glistened with gold thread. Her actions were all premeditated performances. Her charm was described as supernatural by some. She was a pawn, others whispered, baited by her brother and father in their lethal political games. However, many who paid careful attention to her during these feasts noticed something odd. Command. Sometimes a single toast was all it took for Lucrezia to command attention, dispel mistrust, and change the balance of power. People drank, and she toasted frequently. That was the issue. Naturally, the tales trailed her like a trail of perfume. People who asked too many inquiries or engaged in too much flirting were said to become inexplicably ill a few days later. There were rumors that Lucrezia wore a hollow ring that contained powdered poison, which she could gently flick her wrist to tip into a goblet. Truth? Fiction? Because no one could know, she was even more deadly, which was the beauty of her presence. She allegedly recited a love poetry at one banquet while looking straight at a visiting ambassador whose untimely death a few days later caused a little diplomatic issue. The Borgias said they were sick. Rome murmured, "Murder." Still they arrived. Everyone did. Because skipping Lucrezia Borgia's feast would mean missing the very center of power and potentially offending a woman who could turn a grin into a sentence. She didn't have to speak louder. Her poisoned hand held the room in its grip. Cesare Borgia hovered in the shadows, observing, calculating, and plotting while Lucrezia played the siren at the head of the table. He did not have to grin. He didn't have to say anything. A room may become silent just by his presence, and Cesare was the one that everyone genuinely feared at every supper, whether he was sitting next to his father or prowling the periphery. Cesare exuded threat, while wearing a sword that was more than ornamental and black velvet with gold accent. His motions were deliberate, fluid, and well practiced. Without ever raising his voice, he was able to toast a foreign duke and subtly threaten him. Additionally, it was evident from the way the guests reacted, laughing excessively, perspiring excessively, and nervously looking at their wine, that they knew exactly who they were dining with. There was more to these feasts than mere spectacle. They were intelligence operations for Cesare. Over a communal platter of roasted lamb, he watched alliances come together and fall apart. He used casual comments to test allegiances and a single raised eyebrow to assess the aspirations of lesser lords. Cesare recalled every mistake his adversaries made when intoxicated by alcohol and music. Of course, there were stories. Whispering revolt, a guest fled a feast and was discovered the following morning in the Tiber. A noblewoman who turned down his advances and was quickly married off to a relative who had a reputation for hunting accidents. Maybe it was a coincidence. Coincidence, however, felt like plan around Cesare. Cesare allegedly arranged for two competing envoys to be seated next to each other at a notorious supper, then witnessed them almost fight over a spilled cup. He moved during their argument, making a covert agreement with a third visitor on the other side of the room. By dessert, Cesare had acquired a fortress, one had been banished, and one had been shamed. Action was more important to him than words, but it mattered when he spoke. Cesare's silent nod might indicate the delivery of poison or a change in political allegiance. You were unaware. That was the main idea, because the man watching you consume the food at a Borgia meal posed a greater threat than the food itself. One rumor among many that plagued the banquets of the Borgias refused to die. Poison. Poison was claimed to be the family's favorite meal. Elegant, silent, and completely undeniable. It was served charmingly, consumed with praise, and found much too late. The first rule, if you were fortunate enough to be invited to dinner, was to monitor your wine. The streets of Rome were awash with rumors of cantarella, a hidden poison. It could be slipped into a goblet without changing the taste, and it was said to be black, odorless, and loaded with arsenic. During dessert, victims did not fall over or clutch their throats. Instead, after leaving the meal with a smile on their faces, they would fall a day or two later, moaning in pain as their insides burned. Who was held accountable for this flawless, delayed, and untraceable crime? Frequently nobody. Or if suspicions were voiced, there were only rumors and never any evidence. Timely deaths and clever placement. There were many stories. After drinking wine from a silver chalice, a cardinal who opposed the Pope's plans passed away. After bringing his own food tester, who supposedly died before the main course, a rival banker who questioned Cesare's funding disappeared. Were these stories overblown? Maybe. But fear's genius is in that. All you have to do is think it might be true. The serving vessels themselves were questionable. According to legend, Lucrezia Borgia wore a hollow ring that when flicked might release powdered poison. Others thought Cesare always had a flask filled with liquid death in a diamond-studded container. The family gained influence from the rumors, whether they were true or not. Even guests who were afraid of the poison might be controlled, just like those who were poisoned. Poison suppressed opposition because it did more than simply kill. It rendered people docile, anxious, and susceptible to manipulation. Worst of all, it turned every glass of wine into a risk. Refusing a drink would be considered disrespectful. Fear was a sign of weakness, so you couldn't display it. With a smile on your face, you toasted and hoped your name wasn't already crossed out in some dark Borgia ledger. Because it wasn't just about who had the best gift or the sharpest tongue at these meals. Who survived to tell the story was the main concern. The night of the meal of chestnuts, a gathering so heinous and theatrically repulsive that even Rome blushed, is the one Borgia meal that genuinely seared itself into the scandalized memory of Europe. It was more than simply a supper, and it took place in the Vatican's private apartments in October of 1501. Cesare Borgia planned the show of planned revelry, and his father, Pope Alexander VI, approved of it. if not reveled in it. The occasion is described in startling detail by contemporary sources, such as the frequently cited diarist Johann Burchard. As the evening wore on, 50 courtesans carefully chosen for their beauty were led into the hall and told to strip. Their assignment must use only their tongues to pick up chestnuts that had been strewn all over the floor. With goblets of wine in hand, the guests, many of whom were clergy and nobles, sat on velvet pillows and threw coins and insults in equal measure. The floor was glistening with sin and candlelight. Whole roast pigs, glazed fruits, and spicy custards were distributed as the performance progressed, transforming the space into something more orgy than feast. However, this was not mindless indulgence. For the Borgias, no. It was an act of power, a willful violation of all religious and moral laws inside the papal court itself. It was an obvious message. Rome, God, or the Church are not the people we answer to. According to legend, Cesare measured virility like military valor by awarding rewards to the guys who performed the best that evening. The role of Lucrezia is disputed. Some believe she was not even there, while others say she watched and some allege she planned some of it. However, the association was sufficient to tarnish her reputation for many generations. Many historians argue that the incident was fabricated by adversaries who wanted to discredit the Borgia name. Maybe it was. However, the fact that such tales about a pope and his offspring could be believed speaks something about the reputation they had established, because the dinner of chestnuts was a warning, not merely a party, even if only half of it were true. No sin was too big to be publicly displayed at a Borgia feast, especially when the Pope himself was cheering. Pleasure was power. Spectacle was politics. There was something even more eerie about the Borgia banquets behind the velvet curtains and full wine cups. They happened right in the center of the Vatican. Cardinals prayed during the day and feasted at night in the hallowed halls of the papal court, not in a private villa or some far-off palace that was shielded from scrutiny. Sinners danced under lights, while saints were honored in marble. This was strategy, not hypocrisy. One thing, Pope Alexander VI, whose real name was Rodrigo Borgia, knew better than any of his predecessors. He made sure his was memorable because appearances were crucial. In addition to being extravagant, his feasts were intended to test the boundaries of papal authority and blur the distinction between the sacred and the secular. Who could oppose him if he could transform the Vatican into a theater of excess while still holding the keys of St. Peter? Banquets reverberated through chapels and courtyards, spilling across frescoed passageways. Overflowing platters and bare-shouldered courtesans were shown in religious paintings. Cardinals ate dinner with mercenaries, poets, and spies. As a visual reminder that nothing was sacred but Alexander's will during his reign, the most revered area of the cathedral was turned into a set piece of dominance. The act even attracted foreign envoys. The feasts turned into diplomatic pitfalls, opportunities for observation, manipulation, and listening. Whole wars could be changed by a single raised eyebrow from Cesare or a quiet whisper from Lucrezia over dinner. And it all took place under the Apostolic Palace's luminous ceilings. Outside the Vatican, many were appalled. The rumors quickly spread throughout Europe as reformist voices began to emerge. How could the Vicar of Christ, the Pope, oversee murder and orgies disguised as feasting? How could the scent of perfume and roasted game fill God's home? However, that was the risk taken by Borgia. No one dared call your bluff since you ruled so blatantly and conspicuously. And it worked for a time, until it didn't, because even the most spectacular feast must eventually cease. The gutter of the candles, the guests exit, the wine dries out. The world starts to wonder, what did we just witness? In the ensuing hush, is it a last desperate act or a celebration of power? Beneath the flattery and laughing, behind the velvet curtains and glittering goblets, there was always a weird tension at Borgia banquets because everyone knew that certain visitors stayed. Not the way they entered, however. It was an unwritten rule of all Borgia meetings. The events at the table have the power to alter or completely destroy your future. Occasionally a visitor would show in with a lot of confidence, believing they were untouchable, an opposing nobility, an unruly cardinal, a trader who had traveled across Cesare for talks. They would be fed like kings, seated conspicuously, and toasted with grace. Nothing after that. No bloodshed, not a scandal. Just not there. News would start to circulate a few days later. They had drowned in a canal, gone missing, or been ill. Rome soon discovered that an invitation from the Borgias was a threat as much as a compliment. Subtle disappearances were among them. Last seen dancing at a Vatican feast, the young noblewoman was critical of Lucrezia. A family ally received her estate in silence. The Spanish envoy who vehemently opposed Alexander's pontificate passed away quietly in his sleep the night after going to a banquet. His lips were black when an unofficial examination of his body was conducted. Some were more dramatic. During dessert, one ambassador reportedly fell face first into his plate of candied quince. The room went cold. "Remove him," Cesare reportedly murmured as he stood. "He is no longer hungry." Were these deaths really premeditated? It's difficult to say. Every inexplicable ailment became part of the tale, and the Borgias had adversaries ready to disparage them. But there was strength in that legend, because the dinner's reputation wasn't based on the real deaths. It was the potential. Each visitor was aware that they were being observed. There was danger with every toast. Each bite of food could be the last. There was a great deal of psychological pressure. That was the main idea. The terror was real, even if the poison wasn't. Furthermore, fear is a more powerful weapon than a dagger. They grinned as a result. They chuckled. They praised the hosts and clinked drinks. They secretly pondered. Had they spoken too much? Did you offend the wrong person? Have you been sitting too near Lucrezia? Because you were no longer considered a guest once you entered a Borgia banquet. On the board, you were a piece. The Borgia feasts finally came to an end, just like any dinner. Not with a toast, though. Not with cheers, in whispers, charges, breakdown. The grandeur had started to deteriorate from the inside by the early 1500s. Alexander VI was getting older. Once invincible, Cesare was becoming careless. Furthermore, the adversaries they had played with for years were no longer satisfied with the game. The knives were out. In 1503, Alexander passed away unexpectedly. Ironically, according to some, from poisoned wine intended for someone else. Rumor has it that he and Cesare became ill after eating together, most likely at one of their own feasts. The irony was delicious. His own methods undid the hunter. Despite his survival, Cesare never recovered. Bloody, broken, and distant from the table where he had reigned like a prince of shadows, he died a few years later in exile after his power collapsed and his allies turned against him. Curiously, Lucrezia persevered. After leaving Rome, she married into a noble family and became a well-respected duchess. She allegedly expressed regret. Others think she'd just become more adept than her brothers at hiding her game. However, their real legacy, the banquets, lasted beyond all of them. They turned into a myth, tales of terror murmured in bars by candlelight, tales of caution from ambassadors. Centuries later, it served as inspiration for television, operas, and novels. The picture of a floor covered with chestnuts, a smiling pope, and a poisoned cup never really left the Western imagination, because pleasure was not the only purpose of the Borgia dinners. They served as a metaphor, a feast where power was never given away for free, where pleasure concealed peril, and where every mouthful may be interpreted as treachery. The battlefield was the table. The visitors, the players, the pawns, the courses, or the strategy. The world, in a sense, never ceased copying them. State banquets, political dinners, and behind-the-scenes negotiations over caviar and champagne. These are the Borgia feast's descendants. The poison is now more covert. However, the tension still very much alive. Therefore, consider who is truly in command the next time you're at an opulent table, with clinking glasses, smiles, and flattering remarks. And above all, what is actually in your wine? Imagine a society without police, imprisonment, or autocratic rulers. A society in which the clan behind you and the ground beneath your feet were the sources of law rather than a far-off monarchy. This was Ireland in the early Middle Ages, a land governed by relatives rather than empires, and justice had a name in this complex web of tribal allegiance: Law of Brehon. Brehon Law ruled the island with silent tenacity for more than a millennium. long before the English crown brought paper in jails. It wasn't codified in a statute book, and it wasn't enforced by armed sheriffs. It was oral, adaptable, and firmly anchored in honor and community. There were no life sentences or executions. Crime was a rift in society rather than only a crime against the state. And rather than punishing, that tear needed to be healed. Let's imagine that during a battle, one man fractured the arm of another. He would be put in a prison, or worse, under medieval law. He would be entitled to an honor price under Brehon Law, which is a precisely calculated payment in goods, silver, or livestock that is based on the victim's damage, reputation, and status. It was not intended to cause discomfort. The goal was to re-establish equilibrium, heal the wounded party, and enable the community to proceed without devolving into retaliation. This legal code benefited clans rather than kings. Each person had a kin group to which they belonged, and that group was accountable for their behavior. A man's family would pay the fine if he was unable to. The victim's family was entitled to compensation rather than blood if someone had committed a crime. It was designed for a society in which humans coexisted, generation after generation. You had to learn to coexist with your adversaries rather than simply remove them. Brehon Law was really about coexistence rather than dominance. It acknowledged that preserving harmony was more important than exercising authority in a close-knit, honor-bound community. Justice was negotiated collectively, a balancing exercise intended to maintain the tribe's unity, rather than a chilly decree. Justice by consensus was what this was, without a gavel, law, a method of reckoning and repair rather than punishment. And it worked for ages. You brought your case before a Bran rather than a judge in a country without courthouses. No, a Bran did not yell commands in court, wear robes, or use pound gavels. Nor were they enforcers. They served as mediators, interpreters, and memory keepers. Because the law was not codified for the most of Irish history. Through generations of seasoned legal professors, it was verbally transmitted and committed to memory. Brehons had early training and were selected from prestigious legal families. They can be compared to living libraries. A Brehon may quote precedent with a beautiful cadence while reciting centuries-old case law from memory. Punishment was not their responsibility. Restoring harmony, balancing conflicting claims, tracking down lineages, calculating reparations, and suggesting a just resolution were all part of their job description. It was law as narrative. And in critical situations, the storytellers relied on these to tell the truth. There's a catch, though. Brehons could not enforce their decisions. They were unable to forcefully impose fines or call forth warriors. Trust was the only thing that gave them power. People listened to a Bran who was consistent, smart, and fair. They were disregarded otherwise. It's as easy as that. This established a reputation-based rather than coercive legal culture. Credibility was crucial for a Brehon. There were always other Brehons, so their decisions had to be convincing, fair, and balanced. A contending party could move their case elsewhere if one appeared to be prejudiced or corrupt. The system was maintained honest by this competition, and they weren't limited to the wealthy and powerful. Farmers, artisans, and poets. It was everyone's prerogative to look for a Brehon. It was shared, but the legality was complicated. Instead of belonging to a bureaucratic elite, it belonged to the community. You had a chance if you could make a strong argument or had someone do it for you. Some Brehons rose to fame over time. They are mentioned in Irish folklore and poetry. They were admired for their knowledge more than their strength, for discovering harmony where others perceived only strife. Thus the Brehon served as a living bridge amid a world of warring clans and shaky relationships. Not between punishment and guilt, but between egos, between families, between chaos and agreement. They were not feared. They were revered. Imagine a legal system in which there are no gallows in the town square, no jails and no shackles. Because Brehon Law disapproved of imprisoning people, there were no prison cells in medieval Ireland. Punishing the body was not the goal of justice. Its goal was to mend the rifts that exist between individuals, families, and communities. Under Brehon Law, the emphasis was on restoration rather than retribution when someone committed a crime. It was necessary to fix what was damaged. You paid back the livestock plus interest if you stole any. If you hurt someone, you had to pay their honor price, which is a sum of money determined by the injury's severity and the victim's social position. A blood fine was given to the victim's family if you killed them, a precisely calculated amount intended to recognize the loss and stop additional violence. There were repercussions for this forgiveness. It was justice intended for a society devoid of a centralized government. There was no police force, no standing army. Rather, the social pressure of clan ties and collective reputation was used to enforce justice. Your family would be affected if you didn't make the payment. Your honor would be compromised. In a close-knit community, being shunned, boycotted, or ostracized could mean social death. The goal of Brehon Law was to preserve peace in a society where conflicts could get out of hand. It realized that seeking retribution would simply encourage future acts of violence. Therefore, it created a system of calibrated repayment rather than eye for an eye. An error was acknowledged and balanced rather than eliminated. The wound was closed, yet it did not disappear. Additionally, it meant that justice was served swiftly. There were no years of incarceration or never-ending trials. Arguments were listened to, payments were made, and resolutions were reached. Removing people from society was not the aim. It was to keep them in it, responsible for their deeds, but still a part of the group. Amazingly, it did the trick. Long before contemporary concepts of restorative justice would be explored in courtrooms worldwide, Ireland operated on this restorative paradigm for millennia. The Brehons grasped a concept that contemporary systems continue to struggle with. Relationships are more important to justice than merely following the law. As European castles constructed dungeons, the Irish developed a legal system that focused on restoring peace rather than punishing the criminal. Brehon Law was unique in a world where the majority of medieval legal systems viewed women and the lower classes as property or afterthoughts. It wasn't contemporary. It wasn't flawless. However, it was remarkably progressive when compared to feudal regulations in other parts of Europe. Even people without swords or titles had rights and a voice in Ireland under Brehon Law. First, let's discuss women. Under Brehon Law, Irish women were able to possess property, inherit land, and file for divorce from their husbands. Unlike in much of medieval Europe, if a husband harmed her or just failed to fulfill his household duties, the wife might get her dowry back. She was legally entitled to divorce him. In certain types of marriages, both spouses maintained equal authority over their possessions. In addition, women may sign contracts, litigate cases before a Brehon, and receive their honor price, the value assigned to an individual in legal compensation, regardless of their father or husband. A lady possessed legal standing, to put it briefly. That meant she was more than a footnote in someone else's legal story, but it did not imply full equality. Furthermore, the law extended beyond gender. It provided security to poets, artists, the underprivileged, and even people with disabilities. For example, the honor prices of poets and bards were determined by their position in the lyrical tradition. A blind man could not be hit without facing severe legal repercussions. The impoverished could not be penalized more than they could afford. They might make arrangements for labor or goods if they were unable to pay with cattle or silver. Why is it so inclusive? Because prestige and equilibrium among a tribe, rather than riches or conquest, were the foundations of Brehon Law. There were obligations and safeguards associated with each person's function. The seemingly helpless were yet involved. This has nothing to do with charity. The goal was to preserve societal peace. The community would fall apart if the weak were mistreated. Therefore, the law provided them the instruments to protect their dignity rather than to rule. Brehon Law provided a new perspective, a legal system that asked not simply who has power but also who belongs, at a period when justice elsewhere frequently meant might makes right. And everyone was the answer in early Ireland. Rings and church bells were not used to seal marriages in medieval Ireland. It was frequently bargained over a table laden with ledgers, livestock, and genealogy data, much like a business transaction. Marriage was a contract under Brehon Law, and like any good contract, it specified who owned what, who owed what, and, most importantly, what would happen if everything went wrong. Don't assume that one size fits all. Under Brehon Law, there were 10 distinct kinds of marriage, ranging from temporary contracts to equal relationships. In certain marriage between social equals, property was pooled and shared equitably in the event of a divorce. Others were more unfair, such as when a woman married into a wealthier tribe while maintaining her rights to personal property. A woman didn't lose everything to her husband when they were married, but she did bring a koips, a bride price, and sometimes a dowry. Both partners kept their original property in the event that the relationship ended. Everything they gained together was split up in accordance with their union's conditions. Indeed, prenuptial agreements existed in early medieval Ireland, and settlements were quantified in livestock as well. 15 cows may go one way, 10 the other, and 2 may be held as collateral in the event of a divorce. Care was also taken with inheritance. Legitimacy was frequently determined more by public recognition than by church teaching, and children from separate marriages had rights. Marriage, however, was more than just romance. It had a political bent. Clans used it for territorial consolidation, peacemaking, and alliance building. These partnerships were guaranteed to be more than merely symbolic by the legal framework. They were legally binding agreements with explicit expectations and remedy under Brehon Law. Consent was crucial. Even though arranged weddings were popular, forced unions, particularly after puberty, were illegal unless both parties consented. Additionally, one spouse may file for a formal dissolution if the other was infertile, ignored the home, or engaged in repeated adultery. Brehons, who determined the justice of each case based on precedent, social position, and tradition, decided all of this rather than priests or monarchs. Your name was essentially your cash under Brehon Law. Every person had an honor price, which was a legal assessment of their social status. In the event that someone mistreated you, it established the amount of compensation you would get. In the event that you wronged someone else, it established the amount you would owe. It had nothing to do with land or money. It was predicated on reputation, role, and prestige. Consider it your dignity's living credit score. The honor price for a chieftain was high. So did master craftsmen, brands, and poets. It made a difference. Although a farmer's or freeman's was more modest, someone owed you recompense equal to your honor price if they publicly insulted you or hit you out of rage. Additionally, if you committed a crime, the fine you paid was determined by both who you were and who your victim was. In addition to the harm you caused, it was a very individualized legal system. No fixed prices, no generalizations. Economic and social weight were used to gauge everything. This implied that honor went beyond pride. It was lawful tender. It was not vanity to protect your reputation. There were actual financial repercussions. Public insults, slander, and gossip weren't only impolite. They were crimes that could be prosecuted. Someone may be made to pay you in livestock, silver, or goods, and repeat offenders could be punished if they called you a thief or questioned your ancestry without evidence. They might witness a decrease in their own honor price, a sort of social devaluation that increased the cost of all subsequent interactions. Lying in court cases become extremely dangerous as a result. You didn't simply lose face if you were found to have given false testimony. Your honor price decreased as a result of your diminished legal credibility, which also affected your capacity to defend yourself, seek compensation, or take part in negotiations. However, there was also a benefit. By serving your clan, being loyal, and making contributions, you could increase your honor price. Just by leading an honorable life, a reputable warrior, healer, or wise elder may increase their legal value. To put it briefly, Brehon Law transformed justice into a moral economy. A faceless court did not decide what you did. They reverberated across your universe. If you betray trust, it will cost you. It paid to keep your word. Because your reputation was important in early Ireland, you must comprehend the values of early Ireland in order to comprehend Brehon Law. Warning, it wasn't crowns, coins, or castles. The true power lay in kinship, land, and cattle. Every contract, judgment, and legal decision in the Brehon world was influenced by these three foundations. Private ownership of land was not as common as it is today. Rather, the clan, or fine, held it jointly. The land was farmed, handed down through the years, and carefully protected by families. Instead of ownership, each member had usage rights. You therefore lost access if you left the clan. This implied that land was used for purposes other than farming. It had to do with feeling like you belonged. Your position within the tribe was inextricably linked to your legal status. In contrast, cattle were a combination of money, wealth, and means of subsistence. Cows were used to measure everything, including fines and dowries. Even the worth of particular types was noted in legal writings. 5 cows for a fractured bone, 1 cow for a bruise, and more for killing a valuable bull. When someone's animals were harmed, their wealth was wounded, and automatic recompense was triggered. This went beyond simple bookkeeping. Social glue was the substance. Every business deal and court settlement was intended to maintain the equilibrium of the community. There was no hoarding of cattle. They spread, serving as instruments for both alliance building and retribution. It was not a loss of riches to give animals. It was an investment in duty and harmony. Then came kinship, the unseen thread that connected everything. You were never alone under Brehon Law. Your family supported your debts, and your actions had an impact on them. If you broke the law, the fine was covered by your family. Your family helped gather if someone had injured you. Conflicts weren't limited to people. These were negotiations at the clan level. A strong incentive for good behavior was produced by this shared accountability. Nobody wanted to burden their people with debt or disgrace. It also implied that justice was a personal matter. The system didn't only penalize you, your own blood held you responsible. Therefore, the Brehons did not just inquire as to what transpired when they rendered a decision. Whose territory was touched, they questioned. Which cattle suffered damage? And whose clan is now responsible for justice? Because the person was never the focus of law in early Ireland. The goal was to preserve the land and the clan. A crime under Brehon Law was more than just breaking the law. The social order was out of balance. Assault, homicide, and theft were not only personal offenses, they upset the clan's and the community's peace. Furthermore, Brehon justice was not imposed like a hammer, in contrast to the retributive systems of feudal Europe. Like a scale, it extended out. For instance, chopping off a hand was not used as a punishment for theft. Repayment, which frequently doubled or tripled the amount taken, was the penalty. The concept seemed obvious. Restore what was lost and prevent misconduct in the future. And it was successful, because stealing a neighbor's sheep put not just your reputation at danger, but also theirs in a community where your family shared in your liability. There were codes specific to assault. Every damage from a black eye to a fractured rib to the loss of a tooth was valued according to intricate charts. Once more, the honor price system was used to make sure that the victim's recompense reflected both their social standing and the extent of their harm. Violence was not disregarded. It was measured. More significantly, it was settled. What about homicide? Even so, rehabilitation was prioritized over retaliation. The murderer was spared the gallows. Rather, their relatives were required to pay the victim's family the arrack or blood fine. It was more than a payout. It was an attempt to defuse the situation before a fight broke out. A public acknowledgement of guilt, because feuds might endure for decades in a society founded on clans. A single murder might start a vicious cycle of violence that engulfed whole families. Another route was provided under Brehon legislation. It questioned if compensation could bring about peace. Can we acknowledge loss and make amends to stop more violence? It wasn't forgiveness, it was reconciliation leading to justice. It also required effort. Brehons had to deal with complicated emotional scars, political conflicts, and familial allegiances. However, they did so because the alternative, unrelenting vengeance, was much riskier. Fundamentally, the goal of Brehon legislation was not to eradicate wrongdoing. Through tradition, compromise, and restitution, it sought to contain it, absorb the shock of human failure, and redirect it. Put differently, it had nothing to do with punishment. The goal was to keep the peace. For almost 1,000 years, Brehon Law held Ireland together, not with chains or crowns, but with consensus, custom, and community. However, that equilibrium started to fall apart by the late Middle Ages. A growing wave of foreign rule, a centralized monarchy, and a completely different conception of what law should look like collided with the ancient traditions. Feudal law, which was strict, hierarchical, and founded on royal power, was introduced by the Normans in the 12th century. Brehon Law appeared foreign to them, too gentle, too local, and too pagan. The Irish legal tradition was viewed by the English monarch as dangerous in addition to being different, particularly throughout the Tudor and Stuart periods. By the 17th century, Brehon Law had been officially abolished. The power of Brehons was taken away. Their opinions were disregarded as unimportant. Those Gaelic lords who adhered to the previous system were labeled traitors or rebels. Where there had previously been livestock fees and clan discussions, English courts gained control and imposed imprisonment, executions and land grabs. Brehon Law did not, however, disappear overnight. People in rural areas, particularly in the west of Ireland, kept doing things the old-fashioned way. While English judges wore wigs and exercised the king's justice, honor-based recompense, communal resolution, and secret arbitration continued to exist in the background. The notion that justice may be about balance rather than dominance was deeply ingrained in folk memory. Brehon Law has quietly reappeared in the current era as an inspiration rather than a live system. It is studied by academics. It is invoked by activists as a paradigm for creating fairer, more compassionate court systems. Restorative justice movements both in Ireland and elsewhere turn to its tenets of repair above retaliation, because Brehon Law serves as a reminder that justice is more than just following the law. It's about re-establishing trust, maintaining connections, and restoring dignity. It teaches us that laws can be very human, flexible, and local, and early Ireland's wisdom has something to offer in a world currently beset by mass imprisonment, never-ending legal battles, and impersonal tribunals.